Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Nikita Merchant. I'm part of Technical Enablement team and your host for today. Today's session is configuring content-only solutions. And without a further delay, let's meet our speaker, David Tupper, and the moderators, Daniel and Brandon. Thank you, team, and over to you, David.
Thanks, Nikita. Let me go ahead and share my screen out here. All right, good morning or good afternoon to everyone out there, depending on where you are in the world. My name is David Tupper. I'm a support TAM here in Tanium Support Center. I've worked pretty extensively with these content-only solutions over the past few months, and for that reason, I felt it was necessary and useful to have this training, just because, especially if you haven't configured these already in your environment, you can do 5 to 10 minutes of configuration upfront and proactively to save yourself a lot of headache in the long term. So here we have the sort of 10,000 foot view agenda for what we're going to be covering today. First, I kind of want to give some context on what these content-only solutions are, how they kind of got introduced into the platform. We'll move to what the solutions themselves can actually do, as well as how to properly configure, troubleshoot them, and whatnot. And then we'll move to some resources that you can take back to your teams when this presentation concludes for today. Like I mentioned, though, we'll start with the introduction and history of these content-only solutions. Before November of 2022, we had a solution that predated the one that currently is in place, and that was using scheduled actions to distribute our content solutions. So the difficulty with that would be that every time that there was a content update, the admins, the admin, would need to come in and make a targeting change for those solutions being distributed. So every time a new version comes out, you need to make a targeting change. And we have multiple content solutions in Tanium. And as a result of that, every time there's an update, that's multiple different changes that you're having to make as the admin. Then when you multiply that out across, Tanium's 1,000 plus customers, you're introducing a lot of points of failure there. And that's something we were hoping to avoid, which is why in December of 2022, we introduced this content-only solutions workbench into Tanium. I call it the ECF-ification of these content-only solutions, if you will. It's a move from scheduled actions to the endpoint configuration framework, or ECF. With this came the creation of the content-only solutions page. And now, instead of having to make a change every time there's a version update, you need to make a one-time action group change with the ECF targeting, and ECF will take care of the rest, and you, the admin, don't have to worry about it as much. Before we get too deep into it, though, let's define what content-only solutions are. The dictionary definition is solutions that provide content but do not have a service or workbench. So these are solutions in Tanium, but they're not going to have a workbench like, say, your patch, deploy, or comply will. And they show up here on this content-only solutions page. If you're following along at home with your own Tanium console, you can go up to the administration tab at the top there, over to the right to endpoint configuration, and then to the content-only solutions page. That'll land you somewhere that looks like this. And this is a nice sort of snapshot view of your content-only solutions, kind of gives you a rough idea of the health, and we'll get into that more shortly. I wanted to call this out just before we got started. This is what I like to dub the 80% solution in Tanium for content-only solutions. It's a pretty concise explanation of the changes that were made from the scheduled action to the ECF distribution, as well as how to correctly configure that one-time targeting for those action groups. And this should solve most of your issues proactively. And if you follow the instructions laid out in this article, you would be well on your way to having properly configured content-only solutions. There were a few shortcomings that I had kind of identified, though, in reading this article, and I'm hoping that this training can sort of fill in those gaps. A few of the shortcomings would be the likelihood of finding this article is low. I've found from the support side that the symptoms of the problems for content-only solutions don't match what would be queryable in this article, so it can be difficult to find. There's also difficulty implementing the changes as well as knowing the impact, right? If you're submitting changes for a change advisory board, you want to be able to know what the potential impact could be. And this article doesn't necessarily go into that with, I guess, any amount of depth, really. And then finally, there's no troubleshooting information here. So if you run into issues and have trouble configuring it initially, you're going to have a little bit of a hard time trying to figure it out. And that leads nicely into these training objectives that we have here. this is everything that I'm hoping that you walk away from this presentation with, right? So what do these content-only solutions provide? Are they properly configured in your environment? And if they aren't, how can you troubleshoot something if it's gone wrong? So we'll start with what can these content-only solutions do, and we'll go line by line on the most prevalent and most used content-only solutions here within Tanium. The first is default content. This contains utilities, i.e. sensors and packages in the base content set and the client management content set. So if you, again, are following along at home, if you go up to administration and then to the sensors page, you search for the content set, it's going to be everything in that base and client management content set. The default content 7-zip and optional are going to be, in the case of the 7-zip, useful for when you have custom content that needs decompression of files. It's just a built-in utility that you can use to decompress those files in your custom content. And in the case of default content optional, that's going to be utilities for things like tPowershell, run as user. And these are going to be more distributed on a case-by-case basis, where with default content, we're going to see those typically get pushed out to all computers. And we'll sort of get to the recommended targeting for all these different content-only solutions here in a moment. Core content, I would say, falls into a pretty similar bucket as default content. These things just help the platform run more smoothly. Core content is everything in the core content set. So again, if you're on that sensors or packages page, you can see everything in the core content set is what gets distributed by this solution. Core content enhanced tags is going to be a use case basis. It's for the enhanced tagging functionality. So if you've identified a need for enhanced tagging in your environment, as opposed to just the normal out of the box custom tags, you're going to want to distribute this particular tool set to your endpoints. Core content 80 query is one that's definitely really close to my heart, given how much I've worked with it in the past, but it's going to be everything in the 80 query content set. And this is going to give you a lot of ability to query your environment for various AD and local details on your Windows and domain joined Mac endpoints, but we'll get more into that soon. So with that, that's kind of a snapshot view of what these content-only solutions do. Let's look at how to properly configure them. The first thing you're going to want to do is make that one-time action group change. And the way you can do that is to come up here into the administration pane and go to action groups. From there, you're going to want to search for the particular content-only solution that you're looking for. Click the hyperlink and not the checkbox, which is something that to this day can trip me up still. And from there, you're going to be able to change the targeting to whichever endpoint you think is appropriate to distribute to. The question might be, though, which endpoints should I be distributing these content-only solutions to? And these are our best practice targeting recommendations on this slide. This will be recorded and sent out, but if you want to take a screenshot right now, I'd certainly recommend that. The default content solution is going to go out to all computers. And the reasoning behind that is these are just things, like I mentioned, they're going to make the platform run more smoothly. So as a result, you're going to want to push that out to all of your machines in Tanium. Default content 7-zip, as I mentioned, it's going to be a use case by use case sort of thing, where if you need custom content that has some sort of decompression of files, you're going to want to push out this default content 7-zip. Default content optional sort of falls in the same boat, whereas if you want to have PowerShell based or logged on user sessions, then you're going to want to push out the default content optional. Core content, very similar to default content. I would almost say that they could be merged, where it's going to push these standard utilities out to the endpoint. So you're going to want to make sure that they're going out to all computers. We'll see in a later slide that there's a very common issue that arises from not having this particular tool set pushed out, and we'll be able to look at that here shortly. Core content enhanced tags, again, by use case basis, and if you have the need for enhanced tagging, go ahead and push that out. And core content 80 query is going to be the most complicated of the bunch. You're going to see all Windows and all Mac, and the reasoning for that is the 80 query solution allows you to query both local and domain joined details. So you're going to want to push that out to all Windows machines, not just your domain joined Windows machines. And then you also have the addition of the all Mac there as well. And that's for the case if you have domain joined Macs. So there's something to be aware of there, and we'll look at that more here shortly. As far as validating the tool deployment, once you've made this action group change, you can go straight into your Interact console and ask this get endpoint configuration tool status details question. And I would say generally, not only for this particular, I guess, exercise, this tool status details sensor is useful, but also one that's useful to have in your back pocket going forward. It gives you a good view of what the tool's installation status is, as the name would suggest. And it not only gives you the version that's installed or not installed, the counts of those, but also failure or error messages that you might see, giving you, I guess, a lead as to why something is or isn't working. If you're more of a visual learner, you can see this in a more graphical form on the endpoint configuration page. So you'd go to administration, endpoint configuration, and then to tools, and you'll see that there in the bottom screenshot. And this might take a little bit of a while to load if you are actually using it in your environment. The reason why is we're issuing out a tool status details question and then just populating it here in graphical form for you. Obviously, you're going to see different statuses for different solutions. Green is good generally, and you're going to see some maybe orange, red, or blank, depending on how your environment's configured and what the status of all those endpoints are per solution. Moving on, we have a few extra steps to take for deploying this core content 80 query solution. All the other content-only solutions that we've covered so far are going to just have that action group change, and that's that, right? You make the action group change, and from there, the tools will be pushed out and everything should work as normal. But with 80 query, you're going to have to take a few extra steps here. So first and foremost, obviously, you're going to want to make the core content 80 query action group change. From there, selecting whether it's all Windows or all Windows plus all Mac, depending on whether or not you have domain joined Mac machines. And then the second thing you're going to have to do is create a collect Active Directory info scheduled action, right? And what that does is it periodically will query the endpoints for various things, details about its local and AD related details. And that'll populate on the endpoint and be able to be pulled back when we're asking questions for this 80 query content set. And we have some details here for how to configure the package. I wanted to include them on the slide, but we'll also go over them here in the demo, sort of walk through why we have a recurring deployment, why the reissue should be every 5 hours, why we're shooting for a distribute over of 2 to 3 hours. And then, yeah, I would note as a final note for this slide that you're going to want to make sure that you have, if you have domain joined Macs, you have a separate scheduled action for Windows and Mac machines. But with that, we'll get to our demo. All right, so this is what you're going to see when you're coming to log in the Tanium console initially. The first thing that I do when I suspect that a customer environment has an issue with the content-only solutions in their environment, first thing I'm doing is coming up to administration and then over to endpoint configuration. Up here in the top left, we see the 3-dot menu. We click on that. That will bring us to this content-only solutions page. So if your environment is properly configured, this is probably not what you want to see with a bunch of these orange disks here. And what these indicate is that these particular content-only solutions have an action group targeting of no computers, which in the ideal case is not what we want. The way to remedy this, though, is if you come over to here, let's go ahead and duplicate this tab. We can navigate to action groups, and I'll be walking through how to set up 80 query correctly here. If you search for that, we're going to click the hyperlink again as opposed to clicking the checkbox. We're going to uncheck no computers, and then I don't have any domain joined Macs in my environment, so I'm going to search for all Windows. Go ahead and check all Windows, scroll down and hit save. And from there, the tools will instantly start pushing out. ECF will handle that. Again, not only now, but going forward for any future and subsequent updates. You'll be able to see here, if we reload this page, what we'll see hopefully is a green check mark, right, to indicate that these tools have been deployed. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're going out to the correct endpoint, so that's something to keep in mind. It just means that it's not no computers that this action group is configured for, right? So if I had instead changed the action group for 80 query to all Linux, it would still show this green check mark, despite the fact that that's incorrect, right? So we can verify again that installation has happened correctly by using this tool status detail sensor. So we can go ahead and give that a look. You just type tool status details here, should show up. One small thing to note here is that if you just pushed out the solution, this sensor, I believe, has a maximum data age of 15 minutes. So it may take some time for this to show as installed as opposed to not installed, but we can move on from there. We're going to want to now configure the scheduled action to correctly target these machines. So the way I like to do it for Windows machines is to come over to saved questions and then type query in the search bar. You'll see this get is Windows from all machines, which is the question that we want to use to target our Windows machines, our environment. You can check the checkbox and hit load. From there, it's going to load all of the Windows machines and kind of bucket them in this true entry here. I only have one, so one thing to note is you don't have to wait for it to get to 100% here. You notice that I stopped it at 50, and you can click that true checkbox. Go ahead and hit deploy action. And the reason why you don't have to wait all that time is the targeting will remain is Windows equals true. This action will target machines that satisfy that criteria regardless, right? You'll notice that the package is automatically populated, and that's the result of using that saved question to start. This package is associated with that saved question, which makes things easier on you. I'd recommend leaving all of these checkboxes checked, and also in addition to that, checking this collect data from domain controllers here. The only reason why we don't configure this by default is if a customer has a hypersensitive domain controller. I understand that all your domain controllers are sensitive, but in my time working with the solution, I've never seen an issue pop up on a domain controller as a result of this collection running. But on the topic of domain controllers and not overquerying them, we have two safeguards to sort of prevent that. The first you'll see here as we scroll down, this minimum time between runs. Essentially what this means is this collect Active Directory info package will not run more than one time within 3 hours or 180 minutes. And again, that's to prevent us from taking our 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 endpoints in Tanium and having them all reach out to the domain controller over and over again, because that would obviously provide a lot of load that we're trying to avoid. Coming down here to the deployment schedule section, we're going to want to change this one-time deployment to recurring. We're going to want the set the reissue to 5 hours. And the reason for that is 5 doesn't evenly divide into 24. And for that reason, you're going to see this particular scheduled action run at different times through the days and weeks, which is useful for catching, say, your user laptops that come on and offline at different times. Yeah, and while you'd expect your servers to be online all the time, for those ones that have a little bit more intermittent connectivity to Tanium, this can really help with catching those and getting a more complete and full picture of your estate. If we scroll over here to distribute over, this is the second safeguard that we have in place to prevent overquerying of the domain controller. We're going to want to switch this to 2 to 3 hours, depending on the size of your environment. If you're 5 to 10,000 endpoints plus, I'd recommend bumping this to 3 hours, but it really shouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things because you're just going to be doing this collection continuously as opposed to just at one point in time. So I would say, at least in the case of that distribute over, err on the side of caution. If we hit show preview to continue and deploy action, I only have one endpoint that this is going out to, but you'll probably have many. When you do see that, you're going to see all of your Windows endpoints that are online and responding to this particular scheduled action going out to it. Will populate here in this waiting tab. It'll be maybe 2,000 or 3,000, and you'll see them slowly trickle through the statuses, downloading, running, and then hopefully completed. This will take, depending on how long you set your distribute over, anywhere from about 120 to 180 minutes to complete. What I typically recommend is that you wait 2 to 3 collection periods for you to start using the AD query content, just because it'll allow the data to be a little bit more accurate. As as I mentioned, there are some computers that are come on and offline at different times. Now that we pushed out the scheduled action, though, there's one final thing I wanted to note here, is that if you come over here to scheduled actions and type collect, you're just going to see that I have 2 of these collect Active Directory info packages running at once. You're going to only want one per operating system. So you're going to have one for Windows, and if you have domain join Macs, one for those domain join Macs. You're going to want to scroll over to here, especially if you see 2 after freshly configuring it. If this has a creation date, on or before December 2022, that's likely, very highly likely, and I would say almost 100% legacy content. And what you're going to want to do with that, obviously, I don't have that legacy content here, but let's pretend this said March 25 of 2022. You'd want to scroll back over, check this one, and then disable it, and then probably ultimately delete it just to avoid any confusion. So we can just go ahead and clear these out from your environment. And that'll allow, again, the focus to be on the one that's correctly configured and make sure that you're starting from a good starting place. And then finally, if you have any domain join Macs, you're going to want to type is Mac in the interact question bar. I don't have any Macs in my environment, but if we pretended that I did have any, you would click that true checkbox, hit deploy action, and then from there you could type collect, and then we're going to want to select that collect active directory info Mac. Minimum time between runs is the same setting that we talked about earlier. And then you're going to want to change this to recurring, reissue at whatever interval, distribute over at whatever interval. Typically, you're going to have fewer domain join Macs in your environment, so you can kind of make a discretionary call there as far as how often or how long it'll take to run. Going back to the slides though, we kind of covered now everything that you need to know from a configuration standpoint. Now we're going to get a little bit more deep into how to effectively troubleshoot these issues. This is the framework that I use when I'm trying to sort of triage a content-only solution problem. The first thing that I'm doing is trying to look at systemic issues as opposed to localized failures, kind of zooming in on the nitty-gritty, but zooming out and looking at the bigger picture. The first thing I'm looking at as a support tech is a Tanium client functioning correctly? Because obviously, if it's not checking into Tanium, or if there's some sort of other health issue with the client, then the likelihood that these content-only solutions are working is lower than that, right? So when does it show in client status? So you go to administration and then click to the client status page. Does it show there when you search that particular computer or group of computers in the search bar? It's a good first thing to check. If I've eliminated, or at least preliminarily eliminated client issues, I'll move to endpoint configuration, or ECF, as being the next potential culprit. You can see what the rough health of your environment is as far as tools distribution from ECF goes by asking that trusty endpoint configuration tool status details sensor in your environment. Again, like I can't stress enough, worth emphasizing, and having that one in your back pocket can be extremely useful, not only in this use case. And if you've ruled out ECF or don't think that that's the issue, you can look a little bit deeper by doing that tool status details sensor on a specific endpoint, as well as in the case of AD query, going to the Tanium client directory, the tools directory, and then the AD query directory to kind of take a look more deeply there. These are the three most common issues I've seen with respect to content-only solutions. So two of them relate to AD query, and one of them relates to core content. We'll go through them one by one. The first is that inventory hasn't been collected, and this is just sort of a blaring red indicator that the tools haven't been configured correctly in your environment, especially with respect to AD query. You're going to see if you try to ask an AD query sensor before you configure the tool correctly that you're going to get this error: no inventory has been collected. Some potential solutions to that would be, is AD query configured at all, right? Have you made that action group change, and have you made the scheduled action issuance? And if both of those things have happened and those endpoints are in the target action group, then you can maybe look on the endpoint at these collect AD info logs, which we'll get more into here shortly. And the second, again, relating to AD query, is going to be sensors aren't returning the correct information. So you ask a question in your environment for AD query sensors, and it returns with something that doesn't appear right to you. First thing that I'd encourage everyone to do is go and look at your AD infrastructure, verify that that information is actually populating the way you expect it to in your AD. And the reason why is Tanium just going to return whatever the endpoint reports into the workbench. So if the endpoint's reporting something that's false, misleading, or inaccurate, then it's going to also show up incorrectly in Tanium. Also verify too, has a change been made recently? Obviously, we do collection every 5 hours, as mentioned, if following the, I guess, the issue interval advice that we're prescribing. So if the change has been made recently, then you have to also take that into consideration. And then finally, you want to verify that this inventory.xml has the right information, because as I mentioned, the endpoint will return whatever it reports into Tanium, and inventory.xml is where that information gets stored. So your AD query sensors are just pulling straight from that XML. So it's showing up incorrectly there, won't show up correctly in Tanium. And finally, this standard utilities doesn't exist. You might remember me mentioning this on a previous slide, but the error messages you're going to see for this one is standard utilities missing and a path to this Tanium exec wrapper.exe. The first thing I'd check with this one is that are the endpoints in the target action group, yes or no? And that'll be again for core content. So I find a lot of times that with this issue, if someone's seeing this for a particular sensor, you just go to the endpoint configuration, content only solutions page, see that core content is configured, pushing that out typically fixes this issue. And then if that doesn't, I would look into, is AV potentially interfering in some form or fashion with the Tanium client directory, deleting, we can see EXEs here. Those can be viewed as malicious by certain antiviruses if the proper exclusions aren't in place. Moving on, let's say you come to this page and you don't see the content only solution you're looking for. Maybe something we covered today isn't there. You can click this scan for content only solutions button in the top right shown on the screenshot, and that'll kind of initiate an on-demand scan for these content only solutions. This is going to be a pretty edge case issue, typically something that you won't encounter in the wild, but it's going to be more relevant for on-prem environments if you do have one. There's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind in case you don't see something working right there. I want to finally kind of finish this troubleshooting section with a deep dive into AD query and the troubleshooting that you can do with that. This collect AD info VBS is what actually runs when you have the scheduled action for collect active directory info package running. And that Visual Basic script is basically querying the endpoint for various details related to your AD and local machine details. It stores that information in inventory.xml, as mentioned, and this inventory.xml file is what's going to return information when a AD query related question comes down from the Tanium server. Inventory.temp.xml is going to be something that you probably won't see unless you're watching this directory very closely as a collection is running. Basically, we introduced that to allow sensors to continue to return information while collection is happening, while that inventory.xml file is being built. And these collect AD info logs are what that Visual Basic script populates as it runs. So if you're seeing issues with collection or that inventory.xml file is not returning information as you'd expect, you can look in these collect AD info logs for recent collections. Just note that these are rolling logs, so depending on the size of your environment and how often you're collecting, they could have a lot or a little information depending on, again, how it's configured in your environment. This SID's well-known. .xml is introduced primarily for language support. So if you have a common out-of-the-box profile that exists on all Windows endpoints, for instance, say like your default local administrator, if you have that in English, French, and Dutch, that previously would come back in English, French, and Dutch as separate entities. So we introduced this to sort of standardize everything into the English name. So despite the fact that it's being shown in a different language, it'll show the true count for those accounts in English. The pre-stage names file is going to be something that you probably won't see very much or use. Again, it's going to be use case dependent, but the only time you're really going to use this is if you see unresolved SIDs in your environment and you need to get them to resolve. So if you're seeing that full security identifier as opposed to the common name or the pretty name, then pre-stage name is something that you could look at. It's a lot of information. If you don't remember it, this is how I would go about requesting support. First, I would verify that your solutions are properly configured, or at least give it a stab, because that helps us start from 1 as opposed to starting from 0. Has the action group been configured appropriately for the right targeting as we prescribed or as your use case demands? There in the action group page, does the tool show in the endpoint configuration tool status detail sensor, right? This is kind of a single source of truth for tools installation. If it's not showing correctly, that's a good thing to know when you're submitting that support ticket. For AD query related issues, is your scheduled action legacy, right? Because this is something that I'll still come across. today is seeing scheduled actions for this collect Active Directory info that don't match the current set of content that we have. If you're going to submit a support ticket after verifying all those things, I would ask for a tool status details sensor export. This gives us kind of a snapshot view into the status of your tools in your environment, and that can be really useful as a starting point for identifying where issues might be depending on the health of your different tools. For those 80 query specific issues, a zip archive of this Tanium client tools 80 query directory can be extremely useful because the combination of both the inventory.xml as well as those collect AD info logs just give you a really good look into how the collection is happening as well as where the issue might arise. And finally, this is not a content only solutions note, but something for me personally while I have the mic. If you're sending us screenshots in through a support ticket, please, please, please send a full window screenshot. That means including the URL bar as well as all of the Tanium console, just because a lot of times I'll get screenshots where it's just of the error and where it's occurring, but 9 times out of 10, I'm yearning for whatever's surrounding that error. So just a small note from me. I will finally move to some things that you can kind of take back to your teams. So beyond this presentation, things that'll be useful, at least in my opinion. The most commonly asked question when I get when we're pushing out these tools to endpoints is what's the impact going to be, right? Obviously, I don't want a bandwidth or RAM CPU hog pushed out to my environment, especially when you're putting in that CAB request. First thing to note is that switching to content-only solutions will save you both bandwidth and space when distributing those tools and packages. And the reason why is previously, every time an action was run on an endpoint, those packages would have to be downloaded per action to the endpoint. So now that with content-only solutions, the fact that they're distributed by the endpoint configuration framework kind of dedupes the need for them to be downloaded over and over again, which again will save you both bandwidth and space. On the topic of space, the amount of disk space that these content-only solutions will consume is going to be in the vicinity of 15 megabytes, typically less. This obviously is subject to change and may scale in the future, but generally I would say this shouldn't scale to orders of magnitude larger than 15 megabytes. Do content-only solutions use a lot of CPU and RAM? No, right? There's going to maybe be a few caveats, but generally no. There might be a small increase when ECF is checking the manifest, but shouldn't really be beyond that unless you're looking at the case in AD query where that collect AD info that VBS is running. That'll take 5 to 6 minutes at most, and will again only be happening 4-ish times per day. And a final note on the impact, we have a small distribute over time that's in place by default for these tools to minimize bandwidth usage initially when you're distributing them, and that's to kind of reduce the impact that it has on your virtualized endpoints. I have some additional resources here. These are, if I'm not mistaken, written exclusively by Daniel, so they're very useful KV articles worth taking a look at, and just kind of give you a more in-depth look at these default content, core content, enhanced tags, and AD query solutions. But with that, I want to say thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me, and what are your questions?
So we have a few things that are kind of typically asked as we see support cases come through. One of those questions might be, what happens to my pre-existing scheduled actions? So before I imported or upgraded the ECF component that included the content-only solutions, I had enhanced tags, AD query, or something that's now a content-only solution. They were running via scheduled actions. So what happens to those? Those scheduled actions, they should be recreated because these scheduled actions have a copy of the package and definition, which isn't really making use of the ECF content that's now on the endpoint. So we do encourage folks to disable those pre-existing scheduled actions and recreate them to make use of the now ECF managed content on the endpoint. So hopefully that answers your question. Another thing relating to enhanced tags, so somebody saw your comment there of the enhanced tags and thought maybe they had a use case for it and they imported it on the fly during the call, and they went to the content only solutions page and they didn't see the enhanced tags item listed there. So what do we do, right? Did they do something wrong? No, you didn't. Sometimes there's a bit of a timing moment where we have to pause, if you will, and just wait for ECF to pick up that new content only solution that's been imported. If you're sometimes impatient like myself and others, there's a button up there on the upper right for us to tell ECF to go ahead and scan now for content only solutions. So you can click that button, wait just a moment, and enhanced tags should show up for you from there. And then you can go ahead and get the action group configured. That should be picked up and created shortly thereafter. So those are 2 questions. I do have another one where I guess we spent a lot of time talking about AD query, and somebody was mentioning that they made a change to group memberships of a user in AD, but AD query, when asking the question via the sensors, it was still showing the group membership. And that's because the inventory file hasn't been updated since it's my hunch at least, since that group membership was changed. So you just need to either wait for the next scheduled instance of that inventory being collected, and then go ahead and run your saved questions. So, or your answers, your questions. So that kind of also ties into what do people do with, and this is again AD query, what do people do for folks, especially when COVID hit, everybody went to work from home. What do we do about those endpoints that are working from home, and what's really a best practice there? I can answer that one as well while I'm on a roll, I guess. Is AD query back when COVID hit, we did make some strides to try to read cached data on the endpoint. The cached data really is minimal. So the best practice that we do encourage folks for is you can run AD query more frequently on a scheduled action, and it has a minimum time that has to elapse before it's going to allow itself to rerun. So you can run it more frequently. It's going to catch those endpoints that may be coming and going for those remote workers, get updated if the time has elapsed that's needed, and also try to run things or run the inventory where users are actually connected to the VPN, because that means they have access to communicate with that domain controller so that they can then update that Active Directory based information instead of trying to use that cache data. So that's a couple good things there is since we're using cache data within the inventory of AD query itself, trying to limit the amount of queries that we have into the domain controllers via LDAP. We're trying to limit the amount of updates that we're doing to only those things that need updating right then. And then you'll have access via that VPN connection to get the data that you need. So kind of a quick 4 questions there. Nothing new popped open in the question and answer window. Hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone for joining us today.